You are listening to the latest message from Bar None Cowboy Ministries, where we don't care about your past, but care about your future. We hope you are encouraged by today's message.
All right, so turn with me to Acts chapter 27. We ended up with Paul in Caesarea, and where he gave his speeches to the king there and also to the governor of the area, and they said take him to Rome. And so this is where they're starting out to go to Rome. So they're about to sail off to go to Rome. So verse 1, when it was decided that we were to sail to Italy, they handed over Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion named Julius of the imperial regiment. When we had boarded a ship of Armadiatum, we put it to sea, intending to sail the ports along the coast of Asia. Astracus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. That ship, if you look in your map where it says Asia, look right above it. There's the Armadiatum, whatever that name is. That ship was kind of out of there, but here's what you need to know. Egypt was a big exporter of grains, especially to Italy. So they were a big exporter of grains to Italy. Ships would go up and down all of that coast of the Asia, if you'd see. They'd go all of that up and down all of those coasts, and there'll be a fleet of ships that would come with them to export that grain to Rome. And so they would kind of do like how shipping partners do today too. If somebody doesn't have a full 18-wheeler load of something and somebody asks, you're going in the same direction, can we add on our load to it? They would do the same thing. So some of these prisoners, they were loaded up into this ship, and they were going to sail along the coastline of Asia. The next day, verse 3, the next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and allowed him to go to his friends to receive their care. So Sidon, which if you look right down at the bottom of your map, there's Caesarea, then there's Sidon. Sidon, we don't know much about this town, about where if Paul ever really went there to evangelize, because it didn't teach us much about that in Acts or any of his other things, but some way there were friends of Paul's there in Sidon, and there was a Christian church there as well. Possibly from the day of Pentecost, possibly through some of Paul's journeys that just weren't recorded. But he had some friends there in Sidon. When we had put out to sea from there, verse 4, we sailed along the northern coast of Cyprus because the winds were against us. After sailing through the open sea off of Sicilia and Pamphylia, we reached Myra in Lycia. Okay, do you see that next stop? All right, that's where they're at. Therefore, there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. So they got off of that big ship and they went to another one of the fleet ships that were transporting wheat and things over to Rome. Sailing slowly for many days with difficulty, we arrived off of Cnidus. Since the wind did not allow us to approach it, we sailed along the south side of Crete off of Salmon. With more difficulty, we sailed along the coast and came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lycia. Do you see where that happened? Look at the map. Look at the red line. They went from Myra. They were going up through Cnidus, and this little gap There were lots of wind and stuff coming through, and I'm going to get the time period of when it happened, when the sailing happened here in just a moment. But they used that gap to help calm some of the winds that were coming through. And so then they go down to Crete to Fair Havens. And remember, this is a lot of time. It's not day after day after day. It took a while for them to go. In fact, some scholars state that the time that he left Caesarea to get to Italy was about a year. It was about a year journey. Verse 9, but now much time had passed, and the voyage was already dangerous, since the Day of Atonement was already over. The Day of Atonement, the feast, is usually celebrated in the fall time. So they put this at between September and October of when they sailed, and then during this time, it's bad weather all during the Mediterranean Sea time. This is not a good time for them to travel. Okay, I'm not for sure, but I think it's one of their worst rainy type of seasons. You know how we have a hurricane season? This is kind of their typhoon type of a season there. But it was in the fall time. Paul gave his advice and told them, men, I can see that this voyage is headed toward disaster and heavy loss, not only of the cargo and in the ship, but also of our lives. So Paul gives some unsolicited advice to the sea captains. Why do you think Paul gave this advice to these men? He has some experience in shipwrecks. Okay? 2 Corinthians states that he was in at least 3 shipwrecks. So he kind of can see a little bit of what would be happening sailing during this tough time. What do you think the centurion and all of them were going to say to Paul? He's a prisoner giving this advice? No. And understandably so. Paul was a prisoner in their care. And these were the merchant ships. But the centurion paid no attention, or he paid attention to the captain and the owner of the ship rather than to what Paul had said. There could have been many different discussions going on with them. You know, first of all, they were a merchant ship that was providing goods to Rome. So their goods, they wanted to get them there as fast as possible, right? Time is money. And so they were willing to risk going and completing their trip during this time. And so they did not pay attention to what Paul had said. Verse 12, since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, meaning just to spend the rest of the winter there until the good season for traveling comes, the majority decided to set sail from there, hoping somehow to reach Phoenix, a harbor on Crete. Look how close Phoenix and Fair Havens is there on the map. Not very far. So if they were to decide to stay in Fair Havens, they could have ported there and they could have traveled to Phoenix by foot. But they decided, hopefully, we'll make it. It was a harbor on Crete facing the southwest and the northwest to winter there. Verse 13, when a gentle south wind sprang up, they thought that they achieved their purpose. They weighed the anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. But before long, a fierce wind called the nor'easter rushed down from the island. Since the ship was caught and unable to head into the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Just kind of imagine trying to go northern against the winds and then trying to get to Phoenix, which was only a few miles of distance. It looks like it's less than 100 miles of distance. And then you just, this fierce wind, you just have to give up. And you're being taken wherever the wind is going to take you at. After running under the shelter of a little island called Cauda, we were barely able to get control of the skiff. Does anybody know what a skiff is? What was that, Brad? A little boat. It is basically like their lifeboats, or, if they were to anchor out some ways from land, they could take this boat, go into the town, get what they need, and then come back. They would have that behind the ship, just trailing along. It was like a trailer for them, that it was coming with them. After hoisting it up, talking about the little boat, after hoisting it up, they used ropes and tackle and girded the ship, fearing they would run aground on the Syrtis. They lowered the drift anchor, and in this way they were driven along. Because we were being severely battered by the storm, they began to jettison the cargo the next day. So getting rid of any extra weight. Why do you think it's important to get rid of weight, any type of dead weight on a ship? Exactly. Say that again, bud.
So the ship won't be drafting more water, it can go in shallow water.
It can do that, and also it can take those waves a little bit smoother. Verse 20. I think that's where I'll stop. Yes. No. Yeah, verse 20. For many days neither sun nor stars appeared, and the severe storm kept raging. Finally, all hope was fading that we would be saved. I have never been on a cruise. I have never been out in ocean water at night, more than 3 miles outside of the shoreline. But from what I have heard and what I have seen in pictures, if you are in open water in the middle of the night with no lights around, it is pitch black out there. The only light you had was torches and little lanterns. So you cannot see which way is up, which way is down, where you're going at all. And on top of that, Luke mentions that there was no sun or stars to give them any light. So it was severely cloudy and stormy out there on the ocean. And so they just kind of gave up hope that there might not be anybody to save them. But verse 21, since they had been without food for a long time, Paul then stood up and said to the men, "You men should have followed my advice not to sail from Crete and sustain this damage and loss." It was kind of like a "I told you so." Should have listened to me. "Now I urge you to take courage, because there will be no loss of any of your lives, but only of the ship. For last night an angel of God I belong to and serve stood by me and said, 'Don't be afraid, Paul. It is necessary for you to appear before Caesar, and indeed God has graciously given you all of those who are sailing with you. So take courage, men, because I believe God that it will be just the way it was told to me. But we have to run aground on some island.'" So not only did Paul say, "You should have listened to me," but why do you think that he said you should have listened to me in the first place? Because in Caesarea, who was the one that told him it is necessary for Paul to go to Rome? The Lord. The Lord appeared to Paul and said, "It's necessary for you to go to Rome. Now, when the Lord tells you something, especially in an actual vision like Paul had, he is going to keep his promise, right? Has he ever not kept any of his promises before? No, so it didn't matter how Paul was going to get to Rome. He was going to get there one way or another. So he had faith that God was going to take care of him. And so that's kind of why he told them, why don't we just stay here in Fair Havens so we don't have any of this other issue? And then they said no. And so now they're going through these storms. And then this next vision, an angel told them, hey, you're going to make it to Rome, and you're going to make it there with no physical damage. And so he revealed that to all of the sailors. Verse 27, when the 14th night came, we were drifting in the, how do you say that? Adriatic Sea. About midnight, the sailors thought that they were approaching land. Okay, it's midnight. Storm is raging. It's dark. They thought that they were approaching land. Why? Because they probably heard some waves crashing on a beach somewhere. And so they took soundings. What is a sounding? Does anybody know what a sounding is? It's a weighted line. They took something that's weighted and it's a line on it, and they tossed it into the ocean. And then when you pull it back up from where it was dry to wet, you can measure how far it was. And so they took soundings and found it to be 120 feet deep. And then they had sailed a little bit further, and they sounded again, and they found it to be 90 feet deep. What does that mean? It's getting shallower. So that means they're probably getting close to some land. Then, fearing that we might run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight to come. Some of the sailors tried to escape from the ship. They had let down the skiff into the sea, pretending that they were going to put out anchors from the bow. These guys were cowards. They were trying to get away from them. But Paul, having found out this plan, he said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut the ropes holding the skiff and let it drop away. So after they denied Paul the first time of his words, then they heard him this second time. They finally maybe thought that they should have taken his advice. And so the centurion ordered for them to cut the skiff away and for the soldiers not to get on there and flee for their lives. And so they listened to Paul. And then in verse 31, Paul said to the centurion, we got that. 33, when it was about daylight, Paul urged them all to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have begun waiting and going without food, having eaten nothing." Why do you think for 14 days they didn't eat anything? They were battling the waves. They were battling the storm. They're trying to get through there. And if a boat was crashing up and down constantly back and forth and they had anything in their stomachs, what do you think would happen? Probably get seasick. And so they waited. And so verse 34, "So I urge you to take some food, for this is for your survival, since none of you will lose a hair on your head." After he said these things and had taken some bread, he gave thanks to God in the presence of all of them. And after he broke it, he began to eat. They were all encouraged and took food themselves. This does not mean they all became Christians at that time, but they were encouraged and believed that Paul had a higher being with him, and they started to eat, and they started to nourish themselves back again. They were all encouraged and took food for themselves. In all, there were 276 of us on the ship. That seems like a lot of prisoners and people and on board. But this was more than likely a medium-sized ship. It wasn't probably one of the larger ships that's out there. A guy by the name of Josephus writes during this time that there were ships that were large enough to carry 600 men along with the cargo. So this was probably either a medium-sized ship or it wasn't fully stocked if it was one of the large ships. When they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing the grain overboard into the sea. Like we mentioned before, this was a merchant ship that was taking stuff to Rome, and they decided to lighten the load a little bit more because they were approaching land. And they probably were starting to remember what Paul had said, that lives would not be lost, only the ship. And so if they were going to lose the ship anyways, you're going to lose the cargo. And might as well make it as light as you can to not do as much damage as possible. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but sighted a bay with a beach. They planned to run the ship ashore if they could. Okay, look on your map again. Look from where Fair Havens was and that next little arrow. They crossed some deep waters, and they're starting to approach this land called, it's Malta. So it cut off the M. My printer cut off the M on there. Malta. After cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and headed for the beach. But they struck a sandbar and ran the ship aground. The bow jammed fast and remained immovable. While the stern began to break up by the pounding of the waves, the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that no one could swim away and escape. Why was their plan to kill the soldiers? Why were they planning to kill the prisoners?
Because they would die if they didn't.
Exactly. Charlotte and Bud hit it right on the head. Because they would die. Roman law said that they would be killed if any of their prisoners that they were watching over escaped. And so they were going to take care of that before it happened. But, verse 43, but the centurion kept them from carrying out their plan because he wanted to save Paul. And so he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to follow, some on planks, some on debris from the ship, and in this way, everyone safely reached the shore. One of the things that I like about this passage is that this is first-hand account. This is a first-hand account from Luke. And we know this by going back up to verse 1 in chapter 27. It says that word we. He was there along with it. I like this as well because I like some fantasy novels when I read, like Lord of the Rings and then some of those type of things. And it just kind of gives you a sense of adventure. And so Luke is writing this out in complete details. And when I was reading this, I just kind of pictured it all in my head as it was happening. Some people think in a literary style, why did Luke add this to the end of his book? Well, one, it happened. Some people think that it didn't happen and that Luke stole some of this information because people at that time were familiar with seafaring stories. At the time, they like Homer and the Odyssey, they enjoyed all that, and so some of them think that Luke stole some of this and then inserted himself and Paul into it and just created this great adventure type of a story. But we know that it was truth because of the details that that Luke gave. Very, very detailed in there because he was a first-hand account to it. Then we come to the end of chapter 27, and we're going to see Paul's final journey to Rome. So there's not a lot to explain right here. It was just really kind of an adventure type of a deal. But any questions?
A little application is,
When you're in the midst of the storm,
well, when God sends you somewhere, the enemy's going to attack you to try to destroy you and keep you from getting there. But the faith that Paul exhibited in God's faithfulness to assure him ought to remind us that when we're on a journey with God, you can expect storms. They're going to come at you to try to keep you from accomplishing God's will. But then you also need to understand God's going to reassure you on that journey about where you're going and stuff, and that it's got a lot of practical, it's not just historical, but it's, to me, it's very practical to me because every time God got ready to move me somewhere, things would arise, and you just have to really seek God's face to find out, is this where I'm supposed to go? Is this what I'm supposed to do? And he always reassured me. And I think it's good for y'all to know in these last days that if he's taking you on a journey, don't be surprised if another storm is involved in it.
yeah. And on top of that storm and put it in application, the promises, everything in this book, the Bible, when God promises something, it's going to happen. It might not happen the way you want it, but it's going to happen. Some of the reasons why maybe that Luke put this in here is because Luke was familiar with all those seafaring stories that were happening. And in each one of those stories, the evil person, the villain of the story, when they were out in the ocean and they came across this big storm or something and they got shipwrecked or something, they died. They always died in these stories. But this one right here, they survived. So Luke could have been telling his readers that you may be familiar with all of these adventure stories, but we did not die. God was the one that faithfully kept us going through. Anything else?
You know, I think also, we're told not to judge, lest we be judged. And of course, God had told Paul that he was going to go to Rome, and there was going to be all kinds of obstacles to keep him from getting there. And you know, in today's world, we have people that they judge us because we have faith in God, and they try to bring us down because of our faith in God. And if you think back, when Paul stood before Agrippa and Bernice, that was a brother and sister living as husband and wife, judging the greatest missionary ever. So just think about people judging us. greatest missionary ever in the world. We have to deal with that today. Think about it. Because I know I've done the research.
Yeah. All right. Anything else that stood out?
One thing about faith is it's never revealed everything. It's never revealed. It's just enough to keep you walking forward. So that's what faith is all about. And when Paul talks about we are saved by faith and we're called to walk by faith, we don't have to see. There was a family in our last church that I pastored. I think there's 8 or 9 of the kids. And when the dad died, there was nothing said about the dad seeing Jesus or anything. But one of the daughters died first with cancer. And all of the sisters especially said, well, we were there, and said right before she died, she saw Jesus, and she described Jesus to them and all this kind of stuff. And when the dad just went in and ate breakfast, got up from the table, went and got laid back down on the bed, and they checked on him. An hour later, he's gone. But when the mother died, she died in the hospital. And some of the daughters said to me, said, Mama can't die yet, said she hadn't seen Jesus. And my explanation to them was, when you live a life like Miss Ruth lived, you don't have to see Jesus, because you know who he is. But they told me later that on the day she actually died, about 10 minutes before she took her last breath, that was their explanation, that she did see Jesus. Now, I don't know a whole lot about that, but anyway, I'll just let that be what it is to them. But when you walk by faith, you don't have to know the whole story. You don't have to know the whole story. All you need to know is the beginning of the story, and to have enough gumption to trust the end of the story. And that's a walk by faith.
And that's what we see Paul doing the whole time in the book of Acts.
But you just think about what Paul was before.
Yeah.
You see, he was a terrible person.
He was a religious person, but he was a man without principles.
But he changed. I mean,
Yeah.
when he accepted Jesus Christ, he changed. You know, it's kind of like what our motto is here. Not where you've been, where you go.
Yeah.
And that's where he was. So he had to have fantastic faith.
Well, we have to have an encounter with the Lord Jesus Christ on an individual basis, because if we don't, our lives will never be straight. And when we do that encounter and have that encounter, we're never the same again. Not ever. And not ever can we ever go back to that original thing. It just will not happen. And so we have to keep that in mind as we walk by faith with the Lord.
Anything else? All right, you'll have one more week of, I'll ask at the end any questions or comments, and then we're going to go into our video study, and we need some more participation. That's one of the good things about the Bible studies is on Wednesday night, it's not just listening to a message, but it's kind of participating
Amen.
as well, because we can all learn from one another with it. All right. We'll pray and be dismissed. God, thank you for allowing us to learn from Paul, Lord, through the book of Acts. Lord, seeing the church grow from just a few disciples to where now it's impacting all of Asia during this time and then now all across the globe. Lord, I ask that you help us as we take our steps of faith, Lord, that we will continue to follow you in the right direction no matter when the storms may arise, that we don't go the direction that we think we ought to go, but we go in the direction that you have called us to go. In Jesus' name pray, amen. Have a good rest of the week.
We thank you for listening to today's message at Bar None Cowboy Ministries in Omaha, Texas. We invite you to connect with us on Facebook or YouTube. We hope that you were encouraged by today's message.